We've previously taken a look at two of the most influential cultures on what we would call the Greeks. So that would be the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete, and then the Mycenaeans, who were on mainland Greece. Now moving forward, in terms of what we can discern, meaning what can we take from the idea of the Greeks? Now the vast majority of the population lived within 40 miles of the water, 40 miles of one of those seas that borders the mainland. And you see this idea that most is non-farmable. Most of the land itself is dry and bare, and it's much more suited to planting and cultivating olive trees, which helps explain why olive oil is so important to the region and why it's often one of their exports. The Greeks took up the Minoan tradition of taking to the sea to import food, conduct trade, and bring in new ideas. The water, the sea, provided options. We also see that the rocky mountainous terrain led to a fierce independence in which the residents of each city-state were loyal only to other members of their city-state, because it's pretty difficult to actually physically travel in between city centers. Now by the 580s BC, the 580s BC, Greek colonists, and we use this word Greek to indicate a common language, somewhat of a common culture. Keep in mind that that's a vast oversimplification. They thought of themselves as residents of their city-states, but nevertheless, they had indeed spread out. They had founded multiple cities that were scattered throughout the coast of southeastern Europe and the western portion of what we might now call the Middle East or Asia Minor. To do this, the colonists would have to renounce the citizenship that they had to their metropolis. Metropolis means mother city. So if you migrated from Athens, you would renounce Athenian citizenship, and then you'd form a new city, complete with transplanted grain, ideas, and customs. Now these cities initially were linked, but once the new city was established, the colony acted independently. Now this allowed Greek culture to spread throughout the Mediterranean basin. From the beginning, what we know as Greek combined the traditions of Asian, Italian, Phoenician, and African cultures to create something else, something that was totally new. And from the outset, the Greeks believed that they were different or special. To be not Greek was to be called a barbarian. So that's sort of where we get this phrase, barbarian. So this gives us an idea of the people, how they viewed themselves. We also know that slavery was an accepted part of everyday life, as the famous philosopher Aristotle actually referred to a slave as a living piece of property. Now the majority of slaves worked in the fields or worse, in the mines, and they lived a hard life. Some slaves were lucky enough to get an education or maybe learn a trade, like sculpting, whereas some were actually trusted to live in their own homes, manage their master's business. A wealthy Athenian probably owned about 10 to 20, while a well-off individual could own 2 to 3. So most could afford some form of coercive labor. It's estimated that by the 400s BC, so by the 5th century, there were as many as 150,000 slaves in Athens alone. 150,000 slaves, and their rivals, the Spartans, had 4 times as many slaves as they had full citizens. We've seen the importance of mythology for explaining Greek origins. And prior to their emergence, the divine, or the gods, were usually associated with the elements, like wind or fire, or maybe even the earth itself. The Greeks, as you can see, a statue of the god Zeus. The Greeks gave their gods not only human features, but more importantly, human emotions. The gods were constantly using humans for their own amusement, but also to torment one another. And this brings up an important point about the context in which the Greeks lived. The Greeks believed in free will and making their own choices, but at the end of the day, fate is the name of the game. Their fate was what it was. It couldn't be changed. So we had this unusual dual nature of making choices, but there's some things that are simply out of our hands, and it's the gods that decide. Warfare was consistent. All right, this notion of warfare among the Greeks actually began as more of a series of class differences. Now, warfare was more like a melee, where warrior leaders would lead scrums of individuals and they'd fight. The leaders would seek each other out and fight one-on-one while general chaos ensued. This kind of helps explain the Iliad and the Odyssey, where you would have great men like Hector and Achilles duke it out, and we don't really care about the rest. So in this early phase, we don't know much about tactics, but we know that courage and bravery were heavily emphasized. Until the hoplites come along, and the hoplite idea begins to emerge. Now, the hoplite warriors began to replace the heroes of old. We can see here an artist's rendition of a hoplite. You would have bronze helmet, breastplates, and shin guards, and at least at first, you would receive a wooden shield known as a hoplon, which is where the name hoplite comes from. Each hoplite would get a short sword for hand-to-hand combat, and a spear that was 1.5 times the length of their bodies. The armor was protective, so it served its purpose, but it kind of rendered them immobile. You couldn't really move. So the famous phalanx formation was developed. That's where disciplined cohesion comes into play. Within the phalanx, men stood in tight formation, bunched next to each other, and they'd normally be between 4 to 8 men deep. This type of battle was highly effective on level terrain. So on level ground, this worked, where you'd be shoulder to shoulder and spears would be thrust in unison in formation. But Greece was so mountainous that there weren't really many places that you could fight like this, which is kind of a strange dynamic. The casualties with this type of war would often be relatively low because the hoplites would rarely break ranks to chase a fleeing enemy. And truthfully, all this armor was not that great for running. A well-trained Greek army was extremely difficult to beat. The Greeks had an exceptional reputation as warriors, so becoming a mercenary was seen as a viable option of earning a living. Now, the notion of warfare and politics are somewhat hand in hand, and you can see the clear tie-in here. Polis, a city, or a city-state. A polis and the hoplite army are two sides of the same coin. Citizens made up the hoplite army. So these are men that have a stake in society. The hoplites also were expected to provide their own weapons and armor, so they were fairly affluent. Since it was hard to effectively travel from place to place via the land routes, politics and decision-making was local. These city-states like Athens and Sparta and Thebes and Corinth tended to look inward, and you would rely on one another. In warfare, the hoplites, who were shoulder to shoulder, would rely on the man next to them for safety and protection. And so, in politics and daily life, these same citizens would rely on one another to govern each other and to make sure that life was orderly. So the hoplite idea of warfare translates into the notion of the polis for governing everyday life.